The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
So what exactly is this global virtual painting event called Plein Air Live? Well, first, it's kind of like our Plein Air convention. It's people like you who are interested in growth, working on themselves and on their painting and how you show up in the world.
This year's amazing faculty includes the incredible Jill Carver, landscape legend Scott Christensen, the incomparable Kevin McPherson, Catherine Statz, Joe Paquette, and many more to come.
Let's make our own personal growth a priority and be one as a Plein Air community worldwide. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines. We decided to pull out some classics from the vault, some things that still apply today, though they were recorded many, many years ago. This is a classic from Morgan Weistling. It's called Homework.
Hello, my name is Morgan Weistling. Welcome to my studio. In the next few hours, we're going to paint a painting together. And I'm going to start from beginning to end and show you the process all the way through and hide nothing from you. I hope you enjoy it. And if there's any questions, feel free to ask during the video. And anything that you say out loud, I will hear. We just must shout it as loud as possible. We're going to start with stretching the canvas. And I'm going to put together the stretcher bars, we're going to tone the canvas, we're going to go over materials, and then we'll get right into painting. So sit back, enjoy yourself, don't eat too much. It's better to take 4 cookies out of the bag and don't have the bag sitting next to you as you watch this. And let's get going, okay? I start with stretcher bars and do it all from scratch. I use a electronic stapler. You'll need some stretcher clamper things and stretcher bars and canvas, and that's about it. First, I'm going to do a 34 by 27 inch painting for this demonstration. And just using a little mallet, get yourself a perfect right angle. And then I just make sure I secure it with 3 staples on each corner. What I use is Clausen's acrylic primed linen canvas. It has a tooth to it that works for portraiture. It works for small paintings as well as very, very large paintings. It's a tooth that I just find to be perfect for everything. And it's a number 166 Clausen's. Okay, I give myself about 1.5 to 2 inches all the way around the stretcher bar so I have something to grab onto and actually pull it tight. If you don't do that, you'll have nothing to grab onto with those pliers. take away your stretcher bar and just cut. Lay it face down. Put your stretcher bar on the back of it, and here's the real important thing. Make sure your staples are actually facing up. If you don't, those staples will start to show through on the other side. So you want to make sure they're on the other side facing up. If you go to the stores and you buy these pre-stretched canvases, you'll find that they have absolutely no bounce to them. They're not very tight. That's why I like to stretch all my own, and that way I get a chance to prepare the canvas the way I like it. I really don't recommend those store-bought kind. Now, I used to work at an art store when I was in art school, so I was taught by guys that really knew what they were doing on how to stretch a canvas. So I'm going to share with you my little experience on this. You center it, just eyeball it, on the longest side. So this being the 34-inch area, I'm going to center it and put a staple right in the middle. On the opposite side, I do the same thing as I stretch it tight, right? One dead center staple. You just eyeball it. Things don't have to be exact. Don't get out your tape measure and try to get too perfect here. Okay. So now I've got one stretched crease right here. I do the opposite now. I do the same thing on this side. One in the center. Once you get past this point, it's pretty easy. One in the center. Now we've got it stretched so that we can get some nice, perfectly no wrinkle type stretches going on here. I'm going to start from the middle and go to the right on one side. I pull down with the pliers very tightly. If you got a strong arm, this is good. It's kind of hard on the hand after a while, but it's worth it. Then I turn it completely over to the opposite side and do it again from center to the right. Just praying there's not going to be any wrinkles. If you do it right, usually aren't. The bigger the canvas, the more likely you're going to find a little rippling right here on the edges. And what I do is I'll look at it so that it casts some shadow on it so I can see if there's any ripples. Because that's the kind of thing that once it goes to the gallery and you see it hanging, you really wish you hadn't let go. Okay, now that I've done all the right sides, see that? All the right sides. Now I'll start with the left side and go in the opposite direction. Now some people will say, I tightened it so tight that it started to bend, make kind of a twisting thing. That doesn't bother me, because when it starts to twist, if it starts to twist in a way because it's so tight, I just make sure that I've got it on my easel very tightly. And then when it goes into a frame, it completely holds it. No problems, no twisting. So I'll do the opposite side here, and I'll be done. Let's give it the test. Is that dirty fingers or is that a ripple? There's a ripple. There's a slight ripple on this one corner. To save myself having to worry about that the rest of my life, because some collector is going to wonder why it's rippling under one corner, it's worth just taking the staples out, That's why I don't hammer them in right away, because the staple gun doesn't really put them too tight. I'm just going to redo this corner. Because you can never predict this is going to happen or not. Looks good. Now that's a perfect canvas. That's the drum. That's what you want. Go ahead and buy one in a store. It'll just, it won't have anything to it. No drum at all. Now that we've got the canvas stretched and on the easel, I'm going to tone the canvas. Now you may have heard me say I use acrylic primed linen canvas. Not a lot of people do. They like to use oil primed. I won't go into the reasons why I don't like it. I just don't. And the reason I like acrylic is I do not have to use oil in the beginning to tone my canvas. I can use acrylic colors to actually tone the canvas and have it dry within 5 minutes, and I can start painting rather than have a painting sit around for 3 days hoping that it's not tacky anymore. So I'm going to show you how in about 5 minutes I'm going to have a canvas that I can start painting on. All it requires is a spray bottle, a big brush, and any kind of acrylic paint. I use whatever I can find. I'm going to tone it today because in the back of my mind I kind of know what kind of a painting I want to set up. I'm going to use raw umber and a little bit of cobalt blue. What I do to just make my life simpler, rather than having to clean something up on a palette, I just pour it right onto my brush like that, so I'm not messing anything up over there. I start by spraying some water on the canvas, and then spread it around and kind of get an organic kind of thing where it might be a little browner in some areas, and others it'll have a little bit more of a coolness, because I want to mix cobalt blue in here, and I just put it right there where I want it. Now I spray some water like that. Now let's just see what happens. I just like accidents to happen while I'm doing this. This is about the only part of my whole painting process that I can feel like a modern art painter and just be free. I do envy those guys. Wake up in the morning and splash paint on a canvas and get $1 million for it. I find this neutral, kind of warmish, coolish neutral to be what I want, but I do want it a bit lighter. So I just take some paper towel and wipe it off. So I'm going to let that dry. It doesn't take long. If I wanted to, I could set it outside and it'd be dry in a minute. Now, one of the first things that is helpful is to have some idea of what it is you want to paint. Since I'm going to have a model come in tomorrow, we're going to do something that I came up with an idea last night, that I wanted this girl who's about 12 years old to be sitting at a table doing her homework. And I'm going to call the painting Homework. And so, as you might see at this sketch, this is not a good sketch in terms of skill level, but it gives me an idea of how to start setting up my background and the idea of what I want to do. Her pose is very vague here because I want her to be a part of that. I want her to come in and show me what's comfortable, something she can hold for a long period of time. My idea is to have her writing, and her other arm, we're going to kind of see how that goes. You'll see us pose her. So let's talk materials right now and get this out of the way. We'll go over the colors that are on my palette. We're going to get into color much more in detail, but right now I want to just go over what we've got, the brand name, and the basic cools and warms of each color. In painting, you are constantly working with color temperature, and you're taking in an assessment of whether or not you're using a warm light or a cool light on your subject. And if you've got a warm light on your subject, your shadows will appear cooler, and therefore you have to have a kind of a palette that will enable you to mix colors in a cool way or a warm way. So I have a random kind of basic kind of warm and cool of each color. It may not be, like for instance with green, I don't have it, but for the most part you start with the yellows. You might see if you can notice this, whether or not this, which is cad yellow light, it's a much cooler yellow as compared to cadmium yellow. Alizarin crimson and cad red. And we have yellow ochre and raw sienna. Going into terra rosa, it's just a good all-around flesh color that I use with white. And I use raw umber an awful lot. I do not use burnt umber like some people do. I just find it to be more of a muddy color. And I mix that, a lot of flesh tones in the shadows. I use that as my mixture, mixed with cad red. And then I've got transparent oxide brown. And then I use viridian. I've got cobalt blue, cerulean blue, and ultramarine blue. The reason I use 3 different blues is I find I use a lot of cool blues in my paintings. And cerulean being the warmer of the blues. Cobalt's pretty much in the middle, kind of a neutral for me. And then ultramarine just goes really cold. And I find it to be a very... I've heard many people call that a warm blue. I don't see it. I mix white with it. Boy, it just turns ice cold to me. And then here is permanent mauve. Just is a color I use a lot, and it's a neutral kind of coolish, warmish color, and it just mixes well with flesh tones and other things like that. So that's the palette, and I don't really add anything else to it unless it calls for it for some strange reason. And the medium that I use is liquid. If I'm really trying to mix something in a thin way, I will use liquid, but I use it very sparingly because it is still kind of a toxic thing. In my studio, I try to keep very non-toxic. The thing I use to keep it non-toxic is walnut oil. And I don't know if you can see this on the camera. You can't. It's made by M. Graham, and it's walnut oil, and it's not toxic in any way. I could drink it before I've polluted it with oil paint. But it's a great medium, and I use it to clean my brushes, and it's totally compatible. It's totally compatible with oil paint, and Rubens used it, and it does not crack or yellow. And it's no smell, and it's truly non-toxic. So that's my setup. We can talk about my brushes. I use a lot of these Langnickel type brushes. You're going to see me throughout this painting use a lot of these right here. They're made by Langnickel, and I use every size there is. I like the long filberts, and here's another. I like them when they start to get worn like this. And I don't use a lot of flats. A lot of people think my paintings look like they have a squared off flat look to them, but I really am using filberts most of the time. I do have flats out here such as this, but I find them to be really hard to look organic with. They just do to look too hard edged. I use filberts in the bristles as well. These are some sort of sable, I don't know what, mongoose I think it is. But bristles are much harder, less of a bounce to it. They're just a little bit harder, and that works well when you're really trying to shovel on the paint. So I have a whole assortment of that too. My other thing I use are palette knives. This is a scraper. This is very useful for when I'm making mistakes. I can scrape dry paint off my palette or off my canvas without losing too much texture from the canvas. I use this for mixing. I use a harder very hard, less bouncy palette knife for mixing. And then these are the three that I use for actually painting with. And they're very, very springy, very thin metal. I like them to have a lot of give to them. And that's the setup. I arrange things in a basic way. I can't say that I'm going to keep it perfectly like this until my model arrives, but I like to have a general setup of how the colors, the design are all going to, very vaguely work together. I had my sketch that I showed you. Not much to go by, but I did have just an overall feeling of where I'd want to put some objects. I searched around. I found some things that I thought were interesting visually, and I've got where she's going to write. I got a piece of paper here for her inkwell, and I might arrange books so that they come more into play visually and design-wise, but for now this is the general setup. It's hard to tell now, but I've got an S kind of composition going on where my eye will be led in here. It'll lead you to her and then come on out through the canvas towards the top. If any of this becomes a distraction to that, I'm going to change it before we even begin painting. I don't like to make things up. I like things to look the way I want them to look so that I can concentrate on squinting down and simplifying now all this complicated stuff that I've set up. It seems like a lot of things to have to paint, but I find that when you really squint down at things and look for simplified shapes, all of this can become a unified kind of area, and I can see where like that plant in the background and things like that will meld together and actually not be so complicated looking. All right, we've got our setup now. I just want to go real quickly over the kind of lighting that I picked. Now, when you're doing a setup of any kind, you've really got to give this consideration. So I'll show you what I picked. I have large north light window right here above me, and I have the fill light basically becoming the blue sky that's causing some of these blues to happen in her head and all her shadows. And so I wanted to just kind of give an idea of what would have happened if I had left my shades down and only used the light that we have in the room. How different these shadows would be. They would be darker, and they would not have this kind of cool situation that we have set up here. It's causing a softness to occur that isn't going to show when I close these blinds. Right now, I want you to take a look at some of the different areas right under her neck and on the side of her nose here and underneath the eye. When I close these blinds, I want you to look at the color temperature and the value change that occurs. Especially the biggest change will be right under this nose, because that plane right here is facing that blue sky. Now I like that color difference. That's why I'm going for this particular thing. It is more difficult to paint. I should point that out. I'm picking a situation that wasn't the easiest for me, but it's definitely interesting if I can pull it off. Let me show you what would have been easier, and I would recommend if you're just starting out lighting a model for a painting that when you're not a real expert yet, you would want to make it a little simpler. So your shadows should go a little darker. What I would have done for that case is close these blinds. So now let's look at what happens on Sierra when I close these. Now, if you just look, the color under her nose and the shadow areas of her face, even the side of the face here and under the neck, have all gotten a lot warmer and darker. And I can even see, like under this nose is a great place to look, the shadow is so much easier to define where the cast shadow begins and ends. It's not as soft as it was when we had the blinds open. It's a little more harsh that way. Not quite as flattering for especially a female face to have harsh light. So that's why I also softened it up. On an old grizzly, mountain man, you can pretty much light them any way you want. But you want to be a little bit careful when you're doing the female. So let's go back to the setup that I'm going to go with here, and just keep that in mind now that we have cool shadows throughout this painting because of the north light filling in those shadows. It's as though someone's standing up there with a blue card, kind of reflecting the blue into it. So I'm not just making it up, and it's there. Let's go on now with the actual drawing. Well, we're going to start the drawing part of this, and I'm using vine charcoal. It's very soft and very thin. A lot of the stuff you'll find in art stores is these big thick sticks. Try to find these very fine thin ones. You'll see you can get a lot more detail. If anyone's familiar with my work, and if you've ever seen my work on my website at www.morganweistling.com, you'll see some demonstrations of me using absolutely no drawing on my canvas at all. I do like to do that, but when it's something complex lately, I have found that a charcoal sketch really does seem to make things go a lot easier for me. And it's not as though I'm following it completely, but it does let me get into the ballpark. When I give my workshops, I find that the students absolutely cannot learn from me working from a blank canvas and just magically letting it appear. So on this video, we're going to show how I do it, especially with my complex pieces these days, with a full drawing. We'll start now and hope that it all goes well. So let's get going here. First thing I have to do is try to get it so that it's going to position on the canvas and put it where I want it. This is not easy. And there's really no easy way to tell a person how to do it. It's really just feeling your way around the canvas in the beginning. And just none of these lines will stay. You're just sort of feeling your way around where things might start to go. And I'll get a general idea of how large my figure is going to go here. Our model today is the lovely Sierra, and she's going to be trying to hold this pose for the next few days, which I'm sure she will do. You may recognize her from many of my paintings. She's one of my favorite models. I've painted her enough that maybe I could do this with my eyes closed. We'll see. Okay, you're already thinking I'm a genius. This is just amazing, isn't it? It just looks lovely, I know. And it just starts out this way. And I'm trying to think where elements are going to go. And I really didn't even know her head was going to go this large until now. It's always sort of a big surprise. What I did was I was going to do a horizontal painting, and I was cropping it different ways and noticed I liked the vertical better. And so I had to switch my whole idea here so that we've got more vertical. And the reason I did that is I was seeing that there was a more depth to the painting with the tablecloth and the books all leading into Sierra and then out towards the plants and then out of the canvas. So I see this kind of S-shaped thing going on here. And it works so much better as a vertical that we decided to change gears. Let me clean this up just a bit. This is where I shall really begin. Now, often students ask me, well, how detailed do I go with my drawing if I'm going to do one of these drawings? And the answer is enough to know how large that head's going to be, and what position that head's going to be, and where the general idea of features are going to be. How that equates into detail, it depends on you. You'll get an idea how much I need. In a minute, I'm going to talk about some basic principles that I follow. I call them the big three: shapes, values, and edges. And we're into the shapes area of those. And we'll stop for a minute and talk about that. But right now I'd like to kind of just sort of get our feet wet. Let me just take a look. Even at this stage, I like to look at things in a mirror. Not because I'm vain. It's because if I see my painting or my drawing in reverse, I right away get a fresh eye, as though I was a different person looking at my drawing. So I can just take a look at it and say, okay, let's not go and make the eyes one higher than the other. In art school, we probably looked in the mirror as much as we drew. It's like every time you made a stroke, you looked at it that way. I got to the point where one day I went into art school, I sat down at my board and I looked at my blank paper in the mirror and realized I had gone too far. Okay. One of the most boring parts of this whole process for me is the measuring part. It's very exhausting, and what I mean by measuring is looking at shapes and asking myself, okay, that vase here, for instance, where's the bottom of it go? Okay, it lines up right at the spot on her head. Oh, how wide is this to here? How wide is this? It's very, very tedious, but it gets you where you want to be. And we'll be doing that in detail here, but I'm doing it in a very rough manner right now. I start with some area that I can see immediately, obvious shapes. I may fill in just a little bit, just so I can see where my light shapes will appear. So when I look at Sierra there, and you can look at the photo on the back of the box, her eyes are catching light on the tops of her lids here. That creates a light shape that describes her eye. That's all I'm caring about. And I just want to create a little atmosphere of shadow here where that light shape of the upper lid right here is what tells the story. And then the eye actually is all cast into shadow by that lid, and then it picks it up on the bottom lid below. Now on the face, there's this triangle from the bottom of the septum to the corner of the eye, the corner of this eye, and you kind of look at that invisible triangle to tell yourself whether or not you're going too low or too high with the nose, so that the nose doesn't get too long on you. In this video, we are assuming that you have some degree of drawing ability, because there's no way I could devote this whole video to learning how to draw. So unfortunately, I cannot go into every aspect, but I'll hit upon the most important things here. Now, we're not trying to do a dead-on likeness today, so don't put that pressure on me, okay? I know a lot of you are thinking it's already not looking like her, so just shut up. Just be quiet. I don't want to hear it. There's no formula here for how to do lips, no formula to do eyes. It's just pure observation here. I want to make sure that when I'm painting her, I get this plane that's connecting underneath right here where her cheeks are. Really has a nice solid sculptural feel to it. Face isn't quite as wide as I've got it. If I actually bring in the distance between here and here, which is actually narrower, her eyes immediately start to get more wide like they are. Now on this side, it's just cast into this beautiful soft shadow area that I don't need to try to define right now, because when anything that's lost into shadow, it's going to stay that way. I'm not going to be painting it anyway, so I'm just going to, with my finger, kind of indicate that's all lost, lost, lost. I'm trying to pick up the light shapes that really are going to matter when I'm painting here. Looking at those. Using my kneaded eraser or white paint. Just picking away here. Okay. So now we've got the hair on this side ending. Looking at the bottom of the chin, looking at where the hair ends here. The collar picks up down here. See, all this scratching around and erasing, wouldn't it be horrible if I was doing this with paint? It'd be a big mess. I should point out that our cameras are at an angle to my canvas, so from your viewpoint, this is actually looking more narrow in your scope than it is for me. I have a wider view of my painting, so at some point we'll show it straight on, but because of this, it's making it look narrower for you. So I apologize for that. Sometimes this is due to working from life. There's little shifts in the model. And it's not just really me being picky, it's that tiny little shifts can make a huge difference. People get plastic surgery for tiny little shifts and spend a lot of money. They must mean something. So you don't want to accidentally make her corner of her mouth in a centimeter. It's also showing me, we're going to have to make sure we get that in there right. Where this hand goes was probably going to be another one of those areas of constant change, but I'll get the overall shape of it in and then worry about it later. Just where it begins and ends is all I need. So we've got the table in here, and that's never going to change. So we've got apron, and then this little sliver of the table. I can at least rely on the table. And say to myself, well, so long as we don't trip over the table in the next 4 days, that's probably it right there. All right. So we've got kind of where that saucer should be. Those little pinpoints are more important than actually drawing the saucer. At least I just know where the saucer and the cup should be. I'm probably wrong about it too. Oh well. About like that. Something like that. Isn't that helpful? Something like that. That's why you wanted to get this video, because you wanted to hear me say something like that. And then you do this, and then you do that. I think at this point, this is where we'll have a little talk right now about shapes, because I've established enough of a drawing here where I would like to take a little side trip right now and explain what's been going on in my head. I wanted to just sort of throw you in the dark for a little while, and now let's get into what's going on and what's ticking for me. And so let's just take a little journey right now. Now we'd like to take a little side trip here and talk about one of the big three important fundamentals that will really improve your paintings as we move along here. And I want to introduce my daughter, Brittany. Say hello.
Hi.
She's going to help me with a demonstration that we're going to kick this off with. Our subject right now is shapes. Now, under that banner, drawing is part of that. But shapes is the big word that we're going to be using. I want to do a little test with Brittany to prove a point. And that is, I've pulled one of her old yearbooks, not recent, from when she was in preschool. Or no, this is first grade. Anyways, I want her to try and identify from this tiny, practically a postage stamp photo where you can barely see anybody's heads. I want to see if she can identify people off of it. And that will simply prove a point that we will step off from. So there's the photo she's going to be looking at, if you can focus in on it. And I'm going to just point with my little palette knife here. Brittany, can you find, or tell me actually, because I don't know the names of these kids anymore, like who that is?
That's Morgan.
Oh, that's Morgan. Who's this girl who's got her head cut off?
Kay.
But how can you know that's Kay? You can't see her eyelashes. How can you know that?
Because of shadows.
Well, it's amazing.
Patterns.
Who's that?
That's my teacher, Mrs. Sproul.
Okay. Is there anybody in here that you can identify? Not really?
Wait, let me see.
It's a pretty small
Oh,
photo.
that's Tristan.
But he's got a hat on. You can even tell that's Tristan with a hat on?
Yeah, I can really
What about on this photo? Who's this girl?
That's Madison.
Who's that?
Me.
And let's see. Anybody? Who's that?
Melanie.
Wow. I don't remember any of these kids.
That's Brandon, Kay, Morgan, Tristan, Kevin.
Well, that proves my point. She's looking at heads smaller than a pea, and you cannot see any details on their heads, and yet she's knocking them off left and right. That's my point about the big shape. Thank you, Brittany. I appreciate your help.
Thank you.
You try this at home. Get one of your yearbooks out and see if you can't amaze yourself that you can still recognize people off of a photo that small with tiny shapes. I'm going to be using that as a example and throughout this whole thing about what it is I'm looking for throughout the painting, which is that yearbook photo shape. And that's that overall big shape that everybody has, that you can recognize who you're looking at or what you're looking at, no matter how small it is, without any details. I often refer to when I'm working in a workshop situation, we'll have people sitting there trying to put eyelashes in, nostrils in, teeth in, and little tiny speculations of little variations within an eye, and all these little things that do not make this look any more like the person by putting them in. In fact, it almost distracts. What you're trying to do is to get that yearbook quick photo look that you can recognize just like that and never lose it. So as you're painting, it's not about putting in more detail and more detail to get it to look more like what you're painting. It's just trying to work closer and closer to that quick yearbook, quick effect, which we'll refer to now throughout the rest of this video. Now, this is really a talk about shapes, and that goes under the banner of shapes. One of the things that I would like to talk about right off the bat is what that falls under, and that's measuring and looking at abstract shapes, looking at negative shapes, and just recognizing what a good shape is and what a bad shape is. And what I mean by that is, for instance, with the good shape and bad shape, a beautiful shape can be something where it has a flow to it. And you might see that where this is maybe a person's arm, and this is part of their body. And you see this negative shape, and it has a nice flow of a shape to it. It's beautiful. Now, an ugly shape, can actually have too much going on in it, where it has no flow, it has no symmetry to it, or it doesn't have anything going for it design-wise. And this is really about design. And you have to become quite a good designer to understand what a good shape is and a bad shape is. But you're trying to avoid the bad shapes, and you're trying to learn how to recognize them. One way that I did it was by studying a lot of artwork that's good, studying good Sargents and good Zorns and good Soroyas and anyone else I could find, Feshen, and just try to get it to come into your brain and stay there. And then when you see something that works, you leave it alone. And when it's bad, you keep working at it till you get a nice flowing shape. You're always looking for simplicity to get a good shape too. If you notice, the more you try to get into something and create little kind of shapes like this is not beautiful. If it's something that's got a curve in it, you actually just give it a nice curve. If it's something that almost is straight, not quite, make it straight. And then you've got a nice curve that goes straight with it. And then you might have a little angle to it. Beautiful shapes, the design, You just don't go for little road maps. You do not want shapes all over your areas that have road map looks to it. You're simplifying, you're sleeking it down to nice refined lines. So that's one of the most important things as we're going to go through this, what I'm looking for as I'm painting and while I'm doing the drawing. When I'm drawing and how I was taught to draw, there's two things going on at the same time. There's pure observation of what it is I'm looking at, and then there's this knowledge that I've built up through years of study. Now in school, I had already studied anatomy. I had been studying every muscle and memorizing every muscle and bone in the body by the time I was in 10th grade. I was doing it during French class. That's why I can't speak a word of French. And I got D's and C's. But by the time I got into art school with my teacher, Fred Fixler, I had already done all that hard homework. So I was able to really start studying under the banner of real pure observation. And yet that knowledge was there behind, in the back of my mind. But the way I was taught was to actually look and see in an abstract way, as though your model were upside down and you couldn't recognize what you were looking at and all you saw were shapes. When I'm first laying out this painting, I'm really thinking in terms of big overall shapes in an abstract way, totally objective, and I don't give regard to what it is I'm painting at all. And you really got to keep that objectivity to really get a true sense of what it is you're drawing. Knowledge kicks in without even asking it to. It's there. You can't get rid of it. You could have a lot of knowledge there, just don't try and draw on it. Just let it be. And what I mean is when you're starting out, you're just looking at shapes. You're just seeing negative shapes. A negative shape is like if you have an arm and you've got the body and you've got the guy's head and his arm is coming in. This, inside this area of the arm and the body, that's a negative shape. That really is helpful because all you have to do is copy this negative shape and it helps you with what comes around it. You're always looking and you're imagining when you're doing a head with shoulders, you kind of draw an imaginary line so you can see this negative shape in here, what this should be. It gives you an idea of where the shoulders should be and the shape of the neck and the shape of the shoulders. You're thinking and thinking like that. With knowledge, there were classes in school that were using nothing but the knowledge of anatomy and knowledge of line and using just a complete non-observed kind of drawing approach, which when they would sit down and actually paint from something, it was totally confusing for them, the students that were taking those kind of classes, because you want to put in everything you know. If I put in all this time to learn all the muscles and bones of the body, I always feel like I would need to put them in because after all, I know it's there. But in reality, sometimes we don't see any of that. Some people who aren't overly musculature, they do not have it all showing. It's just shapes anyways. So you're trying to just downplay your knowledge. And while I'm painting here, I'm going to be using more pure observation, but I have to admit and let it be known, I do have a knowledge of anatomy, but I am certainly not calling upon it. It's just something in the back of my mind. Just want to set that straight. Also, with knowledge, not just anatomy, I also have a knowledge of inventing figures that I learned through using what's called the mannequin. The mannequin is this memorized understanding of the forms of the body that break down into either ovals, cylinders, boxes, cube shapes, and you kind of just have this overall understanding of the roundness and volume that comes within the body. And each part of the body that attaches to it has its own volume and roundness. And you can learn to invent figures this way. And you just do this. That knowledge where I was learning how to invent figures is something I don't even use when I'm doing this. And yet I know in the back of my mind somewhere it comes out. But it's not a bad thing to learn. Again, though, it's more pure observation. Measuring is another part of pure observation where I am no longer thinking about what it is I'm drawing. I'm looking at the model and I'm looking and measuring distances. I'm drawing plumb lines with my pencil or whatever, my brush, and I'm looking at, well, the ear lines up with the hand. And it also hits, whatever could be here. As the shoulder comes out, it hits this part of the shoulder. And I might be throwing in horizontal lines to say, well, not only does the shoulder hit here, but that's where a pot is behind you. That's measuring. That's distancing things and figuring out distances. That's pure observation. Do more of that. That's what I'm doing while I'm up here. Do more of that, measuring, and also looking for relationships. That comes under the heading of pure observation, where this arm might have a relationship to this arm, and this deltoid has a relationship to this deltoid over here, and the two relate, and you're looking for relationships, and it helps you place the figure on the canvas as well. They can be anywhere, and you can just look for them. I have ones in my mind that I see in faces where the eyes relate to one another, the eyebrows relate to one another, the muzzle of the mouth has a relationship over here, the nose has some here. I've learned these from Fred Fixler, kind of established us looking for these things. There's all kinds of relationships that relate one to the other. Those also help us think in terms of not what we're looking at with knowledge, but just observing relationships. So this is shapes. This is the thing that we call drawing or design, and it's it's the number one thing we start off with. I consider it one of the most important because it's either going to make your painting beautiful or ugly depending on whether you can make beautiful shapes. And shapes in the right place, which is where you place things. You've got to be able to measure well. So that's the little segment now on shapes. We'll get into values in a while, and that's the number 2 of the big 3. And then eventually we'll tackle color. Okay. I think I can move on to our next stage at this point. So now I'm going to establish my shadows with paint. We'll get into some of the average mixtures on my palette, and we'll move on to painting now. I feel like I can start. I know that she's going to have little adjustments to be made. No point in constantly chasing them around. So let's move on now to the next stage.
Well, that was called Homework with Morgan Weistling, and you can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, there's a special discount code in there just for you in the comments section today. We thought we'd pull out another section of Morgan's video for you.
Well, it's the next morning, and the first thing I always have to get to is to put out some new paint. By some people's standards, maybe I didn't need to because there was enough out still from yesterday. But I find that even that little skin that starts to form on top of the paint is something that can linger and get in little pieces on my painting, and I just can't stand that thought. So in order to make it palatable for me every morning, I like fresh new paint every morning. I think this morning is just going to be a continuation to get some of this wet paint that's still on the canvas mixed. I hate to work totally on dry paint. So this is still wet, the areas in the light especially. But it'd be in, this was just painted last night. It's already dry. It's dry. I'm fine with that because I had softer edges going on in the beginning when I was laying that in. So I don't have to worry about having to soften anything in there, but I probably will be painting over it a bit. And when I do, I'll actually be painting in a thin way still because this is all in shadow. I would not want to start painting into that if that was already dry. That would be a disaster. So I'd really like to finish this head off before I move on so that I don't have to work with any dry paint in the light areas of her skin. So when I squint down, her eyelids are dark enough that when I squint hard enough, they really become just a dark eye socket with just this little bit of I would not want to go so light with those eyelids there that they appear to be popping out of the socket too much. So I'm going to mix a little bit of raw umber, terra rosa, white, and I'm going to cool them down because her eyelids are definitely cooler than a lot of the other areas of her face. And I just test. I just do a little dab, a little dot, and I test. And that's how I know whether or not I'm in the right area. Little dots tell me I can go a little lighter. It's a very grayed down version of the flesh tone right now that I'm working in. And there is an area of her eyelids that definitely catch a little more light, revealing the roundness of her eye. So I'm going to be very careful to observe that. Terra Rosa is a great starter for flesh tones, and it's a little powerful, but you can throw cobalt blue into it and it will hold its own. It still maintains its warmth in that cobalt blue. Okay, I need to get the white of the eye that's in shadow established too at the same time. You'll notice I'll start a little mixture if you've been watching this palette, and I kind of work out of it. it kind of keeps my colors harmonious in that way, that they blend from one to the other, kind of share each other's colors. If I did separate little mixtures for every little stroke I made, it would really feel broken up and not really part of the same face. Everything affects everything else. So it should be that way on your palette too. Though I'm not recommending chaos on your palette. It may look that way. There's a madness to it. But it still works. Squinting down and seeing little bits of light shapes popping out at me, and I'm just sort of trying to catch those and downplay everything else. And I'm not one of these artists that hits it right on the very first time, so I know that I'll be visiting this for a while, and trial and error sometimes fits into it. And it really is just a matter of whether I like the way it looks. It's not as though I'm saying once I'm finished with it, it's correct completely, but it's where I wanted it. It's hard for me not to move on to areas that surround the area I'm saying I'm going to work on, because everything does relate to one another, and it's important that the shapes around it are correct too. And I'm seeing this spot. And like I said before, I'm not blending, because when you blend, you lose your sense of whether or not something's the correct value. The area I'm working on right now is a good example. I could just say, oh, blendy, blendy, get rid of that problem by just making it all fuzzy, but I'm trying to work this very difficult transition between the hair, the shadow, and the light of the face. And I'm using little intermediate strokes of value to do all of that for me rather than blend it right now. I can always blend that part together once I do this, but it's just more under control right now, where I just put, okay, it's a little too dark or a little too light, I just lighten it, I put another stroke over it. If I had blended this, then it's almost like once you've blended something, you go, well, I can't touch it now. It's all blended. You can't go into a blending and still have it look blended. You have to start all over anyways. I get off on these little sidetracks, but I really wanted to get into these eyes. But I see things I want to do first. See, that's a little area that needs a transition step of value, a little tile of color, just to get her brow to start turning. So I'm going to put a little bit of a turn on it by changing to a darker halftone, and then maybe one more halftone. And keep it turning. And you see this very harsh shape we have going on with the very hard edges right now, because when I was laying it in, obviously we didn't have wet paint here yet for these two to mix together. But that doesn't matter to me. I'm going to put transition steps between these edges, and then it'll start softening up on its own. If it requires blending too, that's fine. It is hair, but this harsh little shape is actually an interesting little shape. And when we were talking about shapes before, that's what I mean about beautiful shapes. Everything you leave, it may not be exactly what's up there, but design-wise, you're wanting your brush to create almost a calligraphy. And these shapes are just satisfying to look at. Some shapes are not. And it's another way of putting it would be I'm stylizing my shapes a bit as I'm starting out. And then I slowly work them more into reality with gradual steps. But the way to learn good shapes is, in a way, think of a stylized form of what you're looking at. So, straight, squared, round, triangles, whatever it is that fits your personality and what fits the model. So right now I'm seeing that and I'm thinking I might as well get to that before I start really bearing down on these eyes. And I'm going to create a value here on the palette first and test it with a dot and see if we're in the ballpark. Now, we don't want to lose that sense of warmth and yellow, especially as we head into the forehead here. So I'm adding some yellow ochre to warm it up. Yeah. Tiles of color. And then I'm going to give it another transition step of another halftone as it really meets the hair. And a little raw umber, a little mauve, a little. So this is that spot that a lot of people don't know how to handle, which is where the hair meets the forehead, or where hair meets any kind of flesh. It's a tricky spot because you don't want it hard-edged, and yet we're working with brown hair and flesh-colored skin. Well, I create little steps of value to try to make that transition a little cleaner. It can get real dirty looking if you just mix the two together on the canvas. So I'm using Terra Rosa to represent the flesh, and I'm using raw umber to represent the hair, and I'm kind of creating an intermediate step there. So when the two blend together, they've already got another value between them to kind of blend into. I mean, you don't want that look like she's wearing a wig, and that body of hair on her head is really not part of the rest of her. So that's what this is about. I'm trying to keep the two in a transition, one to the other. And I'm just doing that right now with blocks of value. We'll worry about texture of the hair in a little while when we talk about edges more. And I'm really not doing that. I'm purposely staying away from the edge talk because that's really the third thing on the list. And I find that if you take things in stages, it's a lot easier to learn and understand. So far, we've really only tackled shapes and values. And we could stay there for a few years, and we don't ever even have to touch edges, but we will for the sake of this video. Now, the part on her head is, of course, still her flesh, only it's got actually a bit of a different coolness to her scalp as it is surrounded by this dark hair. And I always find that interesting. It goes cooler most of the time. Unless she was sunburned on her head. So I'm just laying that in practically like it's a paint by number. This is keeping things under control. You know, I could be painting this and trying to let it all happen out of an explosion, but you see it's a progression. It's easy to just keep things under control when you go in stages. Right now we're in the value stage. We're not even into color really. I'm going to add more color to it once we have established our values are correct. We can always go over something and make it redder, or we can go over it and make it a little warmer, cooler. But let's get this in first and get the drawing still honed down. You know, there's some drawing things that need a little refinement with these eyes. I mean, the eyes are going to really, in a way, make or break this painting. I hate thinking of it that way. It puts a lot of pressure on these eyes, but she's looking right at us. She's connecting with the viewer. If that's a disappointment to look at, no matter how well the rest of the painting is, it's still going to be a disappointment. So we are going to put a little time into it, making sure we've got exactly what we want. That takes a lot of squinting down and almost takes as much time to take things away that it does to put things in. I'm constantly fighting the battle of, do I want to put that in or do we want to eliminate that? And there's as much elimination as there is adding. As soon as you start showing too much of anything, it gets static. And I'm waiting for that magic to start happening with these eyes. And I'll know I'm on the right track. And I'm using little pieces of value to kind of work into it. Sneak up into it. Not doing anything too crazy just yet. Like some big stroke. I know it'd be fun to see me just do a big stroke and all of a sudden it starts to look like an eye. Well, I'm not Sergeant. I don't like plop it into the eye socket like an egg. I'm a little more sneak up into it. See, her eyes is a little bit of a lazy look to it. I'm going to move it over because it's as though it's looking somewhere else. Again, this is not with blending. And I'll go back and forth between the eyes too, because I'm not going to just finish off one eye and then go to the next. I try to work them together. A bit. I'm also downplaying the idea of her eyes being too blue, though they are. In the beginning, I like to try to keep them more in the family of the shadow. You can always, when I meant about going in with color later, you can always go in with a little flick of blue like what I'm doing right now and just go, there I'm suggesting blue now into it. I don't have to paint the whole eye blue in order to understand she has a blue eye. But I can do that now or I can do that later. If I do it now, it's just one more thing I'm trying to juggle. Okay, when I squint down and I look at her eyes, this is my analysis constantly. What do I really see? And what am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for those light shapes, and I'm seeing, and I compare with my painting, and I'm seeing changes of drawing and things that need to take place first, because I see, for instance, her lower lid isn't quite as wide as I have it. So with a little transition of color, or I should say value, and I'm going to keep it on the warm side. She doesn't have quite as much under her eye as I had. And what I'm wanting to do is, like I talked about before, is set this thing up. Set these eyes up for those things that are really just standing out when I squint down. And it's a little bit of a tedious process of really balancing it. But what I want to do is get these eyes drawn in correctly and value correct, so that I can get that lower lid. If you look at her eyes, they're catching light right here on the lower edge of the lid, right here and here, and they have a beautiful relationship to one another. And then the upper lid is also catching light, and they have a beautiful relationship to one another. And really, that's all I'm seeing, with just a dark mass underneath them that are the irises. But for the most part, you're just seeing those little bits of light get picked up. And even these light shapes under the eyebrows are so downplayed, because you just see those little flicks of light. And that's where I want to be, where when you look at my painting in the end, you look at it and you just see those things and you don't see any other details. That's what I want to do. Sometimes it takes a long time to just paint 3 things that are going to show. And we're setting that up. I'm showing you my process of exactly what I'm trying to do, where I'm going to want to go, and hopefully I'll get there. But if it took me all day today just to do that, that'd be worth it to me, because I'm not in a rush when I paint. My goal is not to be able to tell people, oh, I painted that in 3 days. The goal is just to look at the painting and like it or not. So, I'm not usually in a rush when I'm in my studio, and since this is me in my studio, I really will show you how tedious this can get for me sometimes. But one way to keep this from becoming a mess, because the longer you work on something, the more likely it'll become a mess, is by little tiles of color. I'm still wanting to see if I can push the value just a bit more before we start going into the shadow. And I want to make sure those are in line. Yeah. Okay. Got to hone the shadow socket, the shadow in the socket of the eye now, and really start saying to myself, I'm getting it, because right now it's not there yet. Now there's lighter values within the shadow of this socket. I'm, for the sake of simplicity, trying to keep them somewhat the same, because in our talk about values, we'll see that we're trying to paint with as few values as possible. And one of the ways is to squint down and say, okay, that whole area can be 1 value instead of 5. In shadow, I like to keep it down to 2 if I can. A very dark shadow area, and then a little bit lighter for allowing for reflective light. And then that's it. What I'm putting in now is reflective light more than anything, because it's reflecting off the eyelid into the shadow again, and it's reflecting warm. Same thing under her eyes here. I'm going to allow myself to start to indicate that. It definitely does go a little warmer in here. Flesh is warm. When light hits it, especially warm light, it reflects into the shadows around it, like under the nose, inside the ear, under the eye sockets, under the lip. It reflects warmth into it. So that's why under here it gets so darn warm looking. But I'm trying not to play that up too much. It's real easy to open your eyes, start looking at these colors, and I'd go pure orange in there if I did it long enough. You have to just take a quick glance and go, okay, not quite as orange as I thought it was. Now there is this bit of softness to her eyes that if I'm going to start really getting it the way I want it, I will have to create a few edges around here. In other words, softness of edges, in order for these eyes to start having a little more mystery to them. I'm doing all this work right now with a number 6 Lang nickel. And when I'm working around eyes, I like to use a brush that really mimics a piece of charcoal for me, where I'm really thinking drawing. If I got too large, there's this other way of thinking, which is use a brush that's just a little too big for the job so that it causes you to do kinds of interesting brush work. Well, all that does is make me try to get tricky and techniquey, but it really doesn't help me draw. I'm really trying to still think drawing right now. There's a time, though, for that, a place for it, but it's really not here. Okay, I squint down, and I just do not see much of that blue eye in there that on this side it just wants to blend, so I gotta start dealing with that. See, if I don't, it will not remind me of her eye. And I just squint down and I just see how it just loses itself. How much of this eye can I lose? Because the more I get rid of it, the better. Now this whole area here needs to be cleaned up and whipped into shape. And so if I was alone in my studio here, this is what I'd just be spending the whole day on, just whipping this into shape. Yep, that eyelid is really the star of this area. We really just need to establish it. Now the white of her eye and that lid connect. You don't want to lose that opportunity, so that you don't want anything just standing out by itself like an island. It's connected, everything's connected. It's like a family. And you want to make sure that that white of the eye is reflecting some of its light, or I should say the lid is reflecting some of its light into it, just at the beginning. Now that lower lid is definitely very thick and catching a lot of light. Not too much. And it starts to catch it right here and then kind of just makes a swoop up. And it's also warm. It's at the point where when I squint down, it stands out so much that it calls for palette knife more than it does anything else. So I'll probably, in the end, thicken that up even more by just putting a little layer down of palette knife. Do not want this lower plane of the eye to stand out as though it has no hair casting a shadow over it. She does have lower eyelashes that soften this area. There are places in a painting where you can just go nuts with palette knife, big brushes, soupy paint. It can be very fun, very quick. This is not the area. It won't all be this tedious. But you slow down for the hard parts and you speed up for the easy parts. This is not easy. Now, I've kind of been working on this eye without touching the other, and you can see the difference between the two. One with a little more work on it, and it's softening up as I go. As you can see, the more I work on it, it's starting to get a little more mystery kind of going on with it. And I need to establish where the tear duct lands, because I can see that when I squint. It's always a little on the red side. I squint down. This is where it's really tempting to put my glasses on, because I want so badly to actually see what I'm painting, but I'll just leave them off. So the tear duct kind of lands there, and then there's this little light plane on the other side of it. We got to be so careful not to go too light here, because once I start doing that, it'll destroy that overall darkness of the eye socket. So let's see if I can blow it. It's going to go warmer as it goes up. So I squint down. We do see it. It'll go up like that. And then the side of the nose, the plane of the nose, comes in after it. Creates this little pocket of light. But I'm being very careful not to go too light with that little. You know, there's a tendency to want to go boom, really bright on that tear duct, and I'm trying to do it in a subtle way. I am going to indicate a little more of the blue of her eye, right as it gets hit by light. I'm going to get out a little palette knife. I like my little guy. He's very flexible. I'm going to take a little bit of what we're already working in. No special mixture for this. I'm just keeping it on the warm side. Her lid has a little bit of red in it. But I'd like to sort of pump that up now and see how it looks. If it doesn't look good, you get to see how I take it off. I get a little bit on there, just on the edge. Now you do this and you go, well, some of it may work, some of it may not. You can always just take it right off and try again. And the only thing I could say about palette knife is you just got to do it, see what's comfortable for you and how much you would ever want to use it. I use it because it lays down paint in these tiny little tiles of color. And as you already can tell, that's the way I like to paint. So it's just like using a super tiny little brush instead of a brush. And I'm continuing to just try to draw with it. Now, I may have overdone it a bit. See, if I don't like anything I put on there, you just go back and you just can lift it right off that way. And like I'm going to leave a little bit of what I did, and I'm going to work with it now. Sort of like laying some clay down, and then you're going to move it around. But I see that I really need to indicate that her eye is not quite as large as I've indicated it, or given the impression of it. By doing that, I'm going to have to put in a little bit of the white of the eye. And what I had to do was open my eyes slightly more, just for a few seconds, just to give the impression of the size of this iris. It's real tempting to want to mish around the paint that's already on your canvas to do a correction. It's all discipline to tell yourself, no, don't do that. Just put down another layer of paint next to it or over it. Like I just wanted to take the paint that was there just now and lift it up, but it would start getting dirty looking if I start doing that. Okay. Let's try that again now. I just feel like it's a palette knife thing. I can't get out of my head that I want to do this. Poor Sierra. I'm not even trying to give her a break anymore. Would you like a break? Well, I'm going to make you take one. I'm going to take one. Yesterday. I just started using these Langnickels about 6 months ago. And until then, I was using, for a head this size, these Robert Simmons Signet filberts. They're a bristle brush, and I would do an entire head just with that one brush. It was really, it is a great brush for that. But when I started by accident using some of these, I actually found myself painting thicker with these brushes. Now, I always would have thought if I was using something like a sable or a mongoose hair that I'd probably start tickling it to death and getting a little too soft and a little too thin. But there's something about these that you can lay down the paint almost like a palette knife. They're so pliable in a way, and you just they're also very durable. So I can really mix large batches with them and just sort of lay it down. And when I'm using a bristle brush like this, I do scoop up half the paint I lay down, and that's because they are so stiff. So these are great and useful, and if I was doing big murals, maybe I'd go right back to these. I don't know, but I find myself using these less and less, and I'm buying these more and more. These are harder to find, though, the Lang Nichols. You just don't walk into any art store and find them, but you can find them online. Really, we're just lucky I'm not doing your hair right now. Okay, now settle into it. Can you get this hair? I'm going to do that eye, so yeah, that's good. That's good. All right. Perfect. Well, my old standby, which I always, sometimes I don't even think about it. I just start with Terra Rosa and Cerulean Blue. I kind of just like that combo. I start there and I work out of it. And then I'll start adding a little. I'm wanting to still continue where I left off before this break, which was on the eye here. I am seeing really interesting plane that comes out of this eyebrow, so I don't want to ignore it. And it has a shade of purple in it. It's this plane. I just want to start that going now. We'll get to it when we get to the forehead and really finish that off, but anything that connects to the area I'm working on, I have a tendency to go into. And there's a softness to the... I am going to have to start talking about edges a little bit, but we'll go get into that. But right at the meeting point here. And again, I'm using values, intermediate steps, to try and do this. And I opened my eyes, shame on me. I get scared to death if I've been painting for a while and then I suddenly catch myself with my eyes open. I fear to look at my painting. So I realize, oh no, I was looking. I used to have signs all around my easel. Squint, 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 squint. I'm putting some paint down over here because I know I'm about to go over here and I'll just play with it. And I'm still not very happy with this thing, but maybe I need to mix the upper eyelid and get that in. I squint down. I got to be careful not to go too light here, so it doesn't compete with the lightest lights. A little too much on the palette knife there. You got to be careful. Pick up only what you want. Still too much. Okay, now I need to go in. It's a drawing thing right now. I'm definitely not happy with my drawing. This eye. There's a certain shape she has to her upper eyelid that I'm not capturing. And I won't really like it until I do.
That was Morgan Weistling and Homework. I hope you enjoyed it. You can learn more at lilyartvideo.com. And remember, there's a special one-time only discount in there in the comments section. Thanks for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.